Welcome everybody to the Our Stories program for June, the lives of Arizonans in memoirs and fiction. And if any of you have joined us in the past, you've probably seen Jim a couple other times with some of his presentations on Arizona history. We wanted to invite him back because he's got a great presentation kind of related to literature and Arizona history. And we are working, of course, like most libraries around the country, doing summer reading programs and challenges for our communities to keep kids and adults reading through the summer. And you know, it's 120 out, so there's not a lot else to do, right? So why not sign up for our summer reading challenge and read some great books? We're going to have some samples here of some things that are Arizona based that you might find interesting, that you can use to log those points or just enjoy some reading while you're keeping cool. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I do want to mention that we are taking off for July for the Our Stories series, but we'll be coming back in August. And our August program is called From Chief to Code Talker, a profile of 4 Navajo code talkers. And the person who's coming in is going to be talking about the 4 specific Navajo men that are listed in the Marines and were part of the Code Talker group, and their importance. And the reason we're doing that as August is because Governor Ducey has declared there will be a day in August, I think it's middle of August, that's like basically kind of the official day for code talkers, so a state holiday for code talkers to celebrate and honor the code talkers' legacy in Arizona. And so she will be coming. She is Navajo, and she's going to be talking about these 4 men and their stories. So I think this is going to be a really fascinating presentation and very timely to talk about, like, why do we honor this portion of our history? So we hope that you will join us back in August. That one will be online. We will have our September program online, and then October, we will be coming back in person. We're still seeing if we are going to have the technology to be able to potentially live stream the program in addition to being live at one of the libraries or at a facility. We're still kind of working on that overall for library programs. And if not, most likely we will record it and make it available on YouTube at a later date. So hopefully just keep tuned in to what's happening with this series, because I know you all are interested in Arizona history. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim. And of course, he's an Arizona historian. He's been around for a long time. And I will let him just give a little introduction to himself. And then, Jim, I want you to tell us a little bit about some of the books that you've written. And they may be in some of the libraries, but also like where people can access them, because you've done some great books as well.
Great. All right. So where am I? Oh, there I am. Okay, great. I am Jim Turner, as Jean said, and thank you, Jean, for the compliments. We moved to Arizona in 1951. I was 2 years old, so you don't have to do the math. Because I had asthma. I was the 8th generation to be brought home from the hospital to our colonial salt box house in Connecticut. But we really took to Arizona. I mean, I'm basically a Tucson, Arizona boy, and I took my first class in Arizona history in 1974, and I taught my first class at Canyon del Oro High School in 1976, and started doing Zoom in 1996, and then I went to work for the Arizona Historical Society as the historian in 2001, retired from there in 2009, and now I work for Rio Nuevo Publishers, and I edit for them, and I also write books for them. And I did some of the editing for Code Talker Stories by Laura Tohi, and I'm pretty sure that's who's going to be coming in, because her father was a code talker, and she has done a lot of oral histories. So the most recent book I wrote, actually we did one called the Navajo Code Talker Handbook, which I wrote the text for. But before that was Four Corners USA, Wonders of the American Southwest, with photographs by Larry Lindahl. It's just beautiful photographs. And it is the archaeology, geology, anthropology, just everything, and history of the Four Corners area. So I did a 50-mile radius, 150-mile radius of Four Corners area. And then the one that's coming out is a second edition of my Arizona history book. I'm very pleased with the cover and the whole concept, and that will be out. It was supposed to be mid-July, but it looks like it's going to be more like mid-August. So watch for that one. And back in 2013, I got to do the third edition of Native Roads. And I think that would be, I wrote one chapter, plus I rewrote and updated the rest of the book by Fran Kosick. But that is a classic book, and it has half-day trips, it has full-day trips, or you could probably spend a week up in the Navajo country. So Native Roads covers anything on the Navajo reservation and the Hopi reservation. And it goes into New Mexico a little bit, and that's the chapter that I added. So from there, let's go back to the beginning. I've got a little delay. That's what's going on here. So, Lives of Arizonans and Memoirs and Fiction. And some of the memoirs are, some of the fiction is based on memoirs. So it's kind of one of those mergers between the two. And the first one I chose, originally I was going to do it by the earliest authors. And then I said, I'll go with the earliest periods of history that they deal with. And as a result, I wound up with the best book about the West. This is an incredible book. And if you haven't read it, you must read it. It's on a top 100 list. And if you've already read it, many people said, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Jim. I'm going to read it again. I think I've read it 3 times over the last 30 years. But this is Willa Cather. Picture of her in the 1920s. She was born Willa Cather, December 7th, 1873, in Virginia. And her family moved to Nebraska in 1883 when Willa was 9 to escape TB. So they were health seekers. Evidently in the 1880s, major tuberculosis problems. And of course, what you need is less humidity for TB, but also it's communicable. So you want to move out to where there's only like 5 people per acre. And so evidently it worked. She graduated from the University of Nebraska, became a magazine editor and a high school English teacher in Pittsburgh for 10 years. And then at age 33, she moved to New York City. So she is a writer, just totally career, not something she picked up later. And Death Comes for the Archbishop is on the Modern Library's 100 best novels of the 20th century, not Westerns or Southwest, best novels of the 20th century. And the New York Times 100 best English language novels from 1923 to 2005. So her book just made that 1923 cutoff. It's a fictional account of 2 Catholic priests, 2 young men from Nice, France. And one of them convinces the other one that they should go to America and go to the frontier and serve the churches there as missionary, basically, priests. And they created an American diocese in the early 1850s. And this is in New Mexico, which was, of course, part of Mexico until 1848. So these priests are coming in. 1848's the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and New Mexico and most of Arizona becomes part of the United States. And then in 1854, we have the Gadsden Purchase, which puts the land south of the Gila. So they were sent to take over for the Mexican priests who had been corrupt. They had wives, they had children, They took bribes, all sorts of stuff is what, and you get to hear about all of this. But it's mostly about the friendship of these two men over 40 years. And as I said, he came as a young man in the 1850s, and he wants to build a cathedral, and he does, and that's in Santa Fe, and it's based on Bishop Lamy. So this is the story of, it's a true story based on a true story, and but the writing style and the descriptions and just the people themselves, just the ordinary people and their personalities and their character. Is just, she does a wonderful job of describing the human drama. But I've just picked a couple of things here, and this one is about the Pueblo Indians. They ravaged neither the rivers nor the forests, and if they irrigated, they took as little water as would serve their needs. The land and all that it bore, they treated with consideration, not attempting to improve it. They never desecrated it. And then this quote I used in my Four Corners book. I like to have a quote at the beginning of every section, just like they used to do in the 1880s. And this one is, elsewhere, the sky is the roof of the world, but here the earth was the floor of the sky. The landscape one longed for when one was far away, the thing all about one, the world one actually lived in, was the sky, sky. So that's Willa Cather, and that is 1850s Southwest. And then we move up to 1870s Southwest with John G. Burke. And this book has been around forever. I think it was first published in 1891. And John Burke was a captain of the 3rd Cavalry. He was actually a 2nd lieutenant for most of what's going to happen here. He was born in Philadelphia in 1846. And this is not John Burke, by the way. That is General Crook, because it's basically, it's kind of a biography, but he didn't really want to call it a biography. But John Bourke, we'll see in the next picture. He was the son of Irish immigrant parents. 1846 is when he was born in Philadelphia. So you can imagine, potato family probably. Early education included Latin, Greek, and Gaelic. You can imagine in Philadelphia, if he went to the parochial school, it would have been 90% Irish in that parochial school. So Gaelic was on the curriculum. He ran away at age 17 and enlisted in the 15th Pennsylvania Volunteer Cavalry, 1863. So he went to the Civil War, and I'm not going to name his battles, but he was awarded the Medal of Honor. And his commander nominated him to West Point, which was usually at that time, West Point was, you had to have a connection with a senator or a congressman, or it was usually upper class people. And it was rare that a man from the volunteers at age 17 would be privileged to go to West Point. He graduated in 1869 and had his first tour of duty in New Mexico. And then he was assigned as the aide to General Crook. So this is why he wrote the book about Crook. He was in the Apache Wars and the Great Plains conflicts, 1872 to 1873. And that is at the height and at the finale of these conflicts. John Bourke published articles and books about the Southwest, and he also covered anthropology and folkways. So he's quite educated, and yet he's in the field in Arizona. So we have a wonderful bird's eye view from someone who can actually write about it with literacy. This is up in the upper right here. We've got General Crook's cabin at Fort Apache, and you can actually go in there and see it. And then down here, he was almost stationed in Tucson. And so I've got the Fort Lowell, which is also from that era, 1870s. And that is now a museum for the Arizona Historical Society. He wrote some wonderful things about Tucson. And there is John Bourke with his giant mustache. This is 1890s, 1870s and 1880s. They did pretty well with their mustaches, but 1890s, it seemed to be a thing. Who could grow the biggest mustache? And so he was in the field with Crook, and this is General Crook in his usual uniform, which is a pith helmet and canvas khakis, because it just worked a lot better in the West. But here's what Bourke had to say. They blazed a wagon trail from basically lakeside across the Mogollon Rim and over to Camp Verde, which is, just below Sedona there. And so it took them 11 days. And here's what he had to say about the mule drivers and the mule trains, the pack trains. I am now free to admit that there have been other mules as thoroughly saturated with depravity as Blinky Jim, the lop-eared, dun-colored wheeler in the water wagon team. And there were other drivers who could get as quickly, unmistakably, emphatically, and undeniably drunk as Mullen, down on the official papers as the driver of the leading ambulance, but instead of driving was generally driven. And so we're getting the real nitty gritty. And in some places, he actually goes into dialect, which Mark Twain pretty much started writing in the American dialect, but many picked it up. And Bourke was one of them, and he did a great job with it. But he also describes the wildlife, though, not just and that is partially his school training, where I'm sure, like my parents, they would have had botany as part of the curriculum, but also General Crook taught his officers to write reports and record every detail, including the geology, the geography, the botany, because you're going to need that when you're on the trail. You need understanding of where the Apaches are going to be and also how you're going to get across the country. So here's my favorite section. I've remembered this from the first time I read this. The Tonto Basin was well supplied with deer and other wild animals, as well as mescal, Spanish bayonet, acorn-bearing, oak, walnuts, and other favorite foods of the Apaches. I have already spoken of the wealth of flowers to be seen in these high places, and I can only add that throughout our march across the Mogollon Range, some 11 days in time, we saw spread out before us a carpet of colors which would rival the best examples of the looms of Turkey or Persia. So I lost track of that quote, and I used to say that he looked out over the Tonto Basin and said it looked like an oriental carpet. But I really like the way he phrased it, examples of the looms of Turkey or Persia. And in those days, Persian carpets, even in Tombstone, the saloons sent off for Persian carpets. That was the big fad at the time. So we go from 1871, 72, blazing the road to Martha Summerhayes, an officer's wife, who was actually one of the first to take that wagon road from the other direction, from Camp Verde up the Mogollon Rim and across the rugged mountainsides there, steep cliffs, and over to Fort Apache. So Martha Summerhayes was born in Nantucket, Massachusetts, October 21st, 1844. She studied literature in Germany from 1871 to 73. Her parents were fairly well off, and she was allowed to live with a German general and his wife, and in Germany for those 2 years. And so she fell in love with the military life, with the glamour of the military life and the beautiful uniforms and the courtesies. And so when she got back to America, she immediately married an older friend of her older brother's. And the first place they were stationed was Cheyenne, Wyoming in 1874. And then they came immediately from there to Arizona and were here for about 4 years. One of her sons was born in Arizona. She wrote Vanished Arizona at the urging of her sister in 1908. She had been writing from these various places where they were stationed. And they were stationed at Fort Mojave, and then Prescott, and then Camp Verde, Camp Apache, almost in Tucson, and then Fort McDowell in Mesa there. And so she sent these letters back home, and her children, she would tell these stories, and the mother, you must write these down. So she published Vanished Arizona in 1908, and it has not been out of print since then. So that gives you an idea of how well she wrote this. And as a matter of fact, when it first came out, she got hundreds of letters from officers' wives thanking her for describing what they went through. And nobody quite had the talent for recording this as well as Martha Summerhayes. And I've just got a few clips on that. But again, I'm only giving you my favorite, the top, and what we had the Arizona Centennial and came up with 100 books that you should read about Arizona. And of course, Vanished Arizona is one of the top 3, and definitely something to read, because not only is it a true story, it also is written well and described well. So here she is on the steamboat, the Cocopah. I think I have that. There's the Cocopah right here. And that steamboat will float in 2 feet of water. They actually had one steamboat that would float in 18 inches because the Colorado varies that much, the Colorado River. Sometimes, even then, they had to carry poles to get it off the sandbars. But here she says, they went in August for some reason, and the poor soldiers had their winter uniforms, their wool uniforms. She says, the ice supply decreased alarmingly. The meats turned green, and when the steward went down into the refrigerator, which was somewhere below the quarterdeck, to get provisions for the day, every woman held a bottle of smelling salts to her nose. And so later on Crook's Wagon Road, and I don't think I have another slide for that. So here is the same scenery that we just heard from John Burke. And she's in the Tonto Basin. I was telling Jean, who was just up in the Tonto Basin, that if you haven't been there after reading this, you're going to want to go. And it's not that far from Phoenix. The scenery was wild and grand. In fact, beyond all that I had ever dreamed of. More than that, it seemed so unreal, so fresh, somehow, and I do not suppose that even now, in the day of railroads and tourists, many people have had the view of the Tonto Basin, which we had one day from the top of the Mogollon Range. I remember thinking as we alighted from our ambulances and stood looking over into the basin, surely I have never seen anything to compare with this, but oh, would any sane human being voluntarily go through what I have endured on this journey in order to look upon this beautiful, wonderful scene? And while they were driving it, she also mentions the mule teams and the swearing of the mule drivers, but a whole wagon, a six mule team, slipped right off the cliff, fell right into the basin there, and they lost it. And she remembered thinking how sad it was for those mules, and she didn't even bother to wonder what was on that wagon load. And it turned out that a barrel of her china was on that wagon load, and she was just devastated because as an officer's wife, even at Fort Apache, you're supposed to entertain and give tea parties for the other officers' wives. So there was an officer's wife who was just getting transferred out, and she gave her a whole set of china. She says, I don't think I'll be needing this. And Martha Summerhayes said, that was very nice of us and very gracious to say that, you know, she didn't really need it, but it was quite a sacrifice, and the wives did stick together. She went back. Her son was born at Fort Apache, And she was presented, it was a wonderful cradle board, which she describes in the book. And then she went back to Nantucket and then came back to Arizona. And as they were traveling to Fort McDowell, they were around Gila Bend and traveling by wagon, of course. And Jack and I sat down by the campfire, musing over the hard times we were having, when suddenly I heard a terrified cry from my little son. We rushed to the tent, lighted a candle, and oh, horror upon horrors. His head and face were covered with large black ants. He was wailing helplessly and beating the air with his tiny arms. My God, cried Jack, we've camped over an anthill. I seized the child and, brushing off the ants as I fled, brought him out to the fire, where by its light I succeeded in getting rid of them all. But the horror of it, can any mother brought up in God's country with kind nurses and loved ones to minister to her child for a moment imagine how I felt when I saw those hideous, three-bodied, long-legged black ants. And so the book is full of wonderful stuff. I've given away one of the best ones, but there are plenty of others in there for you to read. And that is Martha Summerhayes and her true story, Memoirs. And now we have Helen Sakakawapta. Easy to say. Me and Mine, the life story of Helen Sakakawapta, a Hopi Indian, as told to Louise Udall. And in the 1960s, once a week, Helen and Louise rode to the Maricopa Reservation for the Mormon Relief Society meetings. And Helen at this time was living in Phoenix. Her children were going to college, and she set up a home so that they didn't have to live in a dormitory, and I'm sure did the cooking and cleaning, and she could be with her children while they were going to college. And so she kept telling, the Maricopa Reservation, 40 miles west of Phoenix, basically. So on those rides, she would tell stories of her life to Louise Udall. And the Udalls, big family, Mo and Stu, but many others came to Arizona in the White Mountains area, Snowflake and Show Low area in the 1870s, Holbrook, all of that up in that. And so Louise knew, and it's Mormon country up there, and also they're really big on the mission work. And so Louise convinced her, well, why don't you tell me the stories and I will write them down? And that's how this book came about. So we're actually getting a biography of a Hopi Indian, and she lived through a lot. He was born in 1900, and in about 1900, about the time she was born, maybe a little earlier, the U.S. government had stirred up a conflict between two branches of the Hopi, and they called them back then the hostiles and the friendlies. Every Native American tribe that signed a treaty in Arizona had that clause that said, and you will allow your children to be educated in American schools. Well, the area was so large that they couldn't put a day school in every Indian village, so they created boarding schools, and they would forcibly come and take the children away. And they hired, the U.S. government hired Navajos to serve as the truant police, and they issued them army uniforms, and they were to enforce the school law. So little Helen her parents were part of the hostile, obviously, meaning they did not go along with this. They did not want their children to be educated, and not only because they'd be taken away, but because they had a very intricate belief system that was almost exactly opposite of what the Americans were going to be teaching them. Not only that, but they would punish them for practicing their rights and their beliefs. So the hostile parents tried to hide the children and took them away from the villages in the mornings and hid them under rabbit pelt blankets or in the rafters of their houses. And Helen was eventually caught and sent to the Arribi Day School, but she says not before many times outwitting Mr. Schoolman. So she was very happy to play this little game and try to get away from him. And so she went to Arribi Day School, and then in late October 1906, the troops arrived and took 82 children by wagon to the boarding school at Keams Canyon. And there is a rare picture I just found about a year ago online of the Keams Canyon Indian School in 1905, and she arrived in 1906. 82 children by wagon, and the older ones looked after the younger ones. And since she was 6 years old, she would have been the one that would have been looked after by the 12-year-olds, probably. I don't think they were much older than that. She said she had never seen so much light at night. They got there late and all the buildings were lit up. We thought it was wonderful, and then we became homesick. In the evenings, we would gather in a corner and cry softly so the matron couldn't hear us. And so that is a true relation. But she got used to it. And not only that, she loved the education. She was sharp and she did well. So at the end of 1915, she defied her parents and went to the Phoenix Indian School, and that was voluntary. She didn't have to do that. She still loved to learn, and this is the Phoenix Indian School down here, which is still there in the Encanto neighborhood. And she said she still loved to learn and earned money with embroidery, crochet, and tatting, and never spent money on candy or pop, just more sewing supplies. So she was frugal and she liked to sew. And my new book is going to feature this picture of the art class at the Phoenix Indian School. And, you know, we've got this pendulum of how we see the Indians and how we see ourselves. And I thought, you know, it was mostly terrible stuff. And when you read the books, it seems to be terrible stuff that happened to them. I didn't realize they had an art class. And this is a really nice window into something other than. And the pictures are very good if you can see them. Just did a great job with them. So one evening, she said she stayed in the summer and was a housekeeper for the superintendent, J. Brown's family. She said, one evening I was in the Brown's kitchen doing the dishes when the doorbell rang. One of the Brown's daughters went to the door and then came to the kitchen and said, "It is for you." When I got to the door, there stood Marjorie Sakakawapta. And she had met him on the train on their way to Phoenix from Holbrook. And he had a package in his arms. I was so glad to see him from home that I guess I lit up. So I stepped out onto the porch to take the bundle from him and thanked him. And we talked a little. And then she says, P.S. Marjorie has been the light of my life ever since. And that was 44 years at the time of the book was published. She went home after 13 years, and her mother accepted her new clothes and her new ways, but her sister did not. She helped, this is 1918, so she helped Miss Sarah Abbott with the Spanish influenza, which killed her brother and her mother. She and Marjorie married, he went to work for an Indian school in Idaho, and then they came home and started a ranch in the Hopi area, the Four Corners area. Her son, Marjorie Jr., became a professor of anthropology at the University of Arizona and taught the Hopi way, which I just think is a wonderful circle and a way to tie all of this together. And so that is that story. I'm really interested in seeing if I have a problem with my power, but I don't think I do yet. So we go next to the fiction of all fictions. And I prefer the fictions that are really true to the case. And this one is just, I'll just read what I've got here. Zane Grey was born in Zanesville, Ohio in 1872. His ancestor, Robert Zane, came to the colonies in 1673. And his maternal great-grandfather, Ebenezer Zane, was in the American Revolutionary War. And they were given, after the war, they were given for their service, they were given land on the frontier, which would have been Zanesville. He founded Zanesville, Ohio, on a government land grant from his service in the Revolutionary War. Zane Grey was an avid reader of Robinson Crusoe and the Leatherstocking Tales, which is the last of the Mohicans. It's considered the first of the frontier writing, 1823, James Fenimore Cooper. And he also read the dime novels, which came out in the 1860s, and they perpetuated the myth of the noble frontiersman against the civilized, corrupt cities and governments and that sort of thing. So his characters are also the lone frontiersman who goes outside the law to do what he feels is right. And he got a baseball. His father was a dentist, and Zane did extractions as a teenager until the state dental board caught on to him. And then he got a baseball scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania, and there he is in the Pennsylvania uniform, I'm sure. And he studied dentistry, graduated in 1896, and took up practice in New York City. He met Dolly, his wife, on an outing. They loved the outdoors and canoeing and camping, but her proofreading and copy editing skills gradually improved Zane Grey's writing. So he started writing when he was 14, but a lot of the very colorful descriptions, I'm sure she helped him put the sentences together so that they really sounded beautiful. He's written about 4 books that literary folks think are great, and then another 23 that they don't think are great. And I think Dolly probably had a big hand in the ones that really did well. In 1907, he attended a lecture by C.J. Buffalo Jones, who was a real character who convinced Teddy Roosevelt to set up a buffalo ranch near St. John's, Arizona, because the buffalo were dying out. He had been a buffalo hunter. He was really sad about how many of them they just killed and left. So in the following year, they went on a mountain lion hunt to the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And that's where Zane Grey fell in love with Arizona and came back many times. And here's what he says: "Surely of all the gifts that have come to me from contact with the West, this one of sheer love of wildness, beauty, color, and grandeur has been the greatest and most significant of my work." And many of his books take place in Monument Valley. And he stipulated when the movies started filming his works in 1918, he said, you must film them on location. And so the first film in Monument Valley, 1923, The Vanished American, is a Zane Grey script. And from then on, John Ford got a hold of it in 1939 and really took off. But that was his love of the West came from that. And his books were illustrated by, he worked for Harper and Row, and his books were illustrated by the best people out there at the time. So this is one from Riders of the Purple Sage. And it was filmed, that book was filmed in 1918, 1925, 1931, 1941, and 1996. And I believe this is from the 1931. That's Ellen Ballin, the Mabel Ballin, I'm sorry. But the original plot, it's the lone frontiersman against the corrupt Mormons, polygamous Mormons, who are persecuting anybody who is not Mormon. And so that's how the hero saves the day, by shutting them out. And all the other movies switch the villain to corrupt judges or lawyers. And that's what you're going to get in almost every Western movie ever since then. It's usually the mayor and the banker and the judge that are against, and they are on the side of the big ranchers who are harassing the little farmers. So you got the same plot over and over again. And here is a clip from that. Jane, greeting him, looked up into a face that she trusted instinctively and which riveted her attention. It had all the characteristics of the range riders, the leanness, the red burn of the sun, and the set changelessness that came from years of silence and solitude. But it was not these which held her, rather the intensity of his gaze and a strained weariness, a piercing wistfulness, a keen gray sight, as if the man was forever looking for that which he never found. Jane's subtle woman's intuition, even in that brief instant, felt a sadness, a hungering, a secret. So that sounds like Dolly's writing there, but it is when you get that steely glare of the lone cowboy. That's where it came from. It came from this sort of description, and very well done as far as I'm concerned. And now we have another biography. Very lucky to have this one. Anna Moore Shaw was a Pima Indian born in the traditional brush dwelling on the Gila River Reservation in 1898. And this is not Anna Moore Shaw, but these are Pima girls from that era. And I thought, why not? You know, we don't have a picture of Anna Moore Shaw, but I just love this little photo. And I'm sure it's from that time. Her parents converted to Christianity, and she got her high school diploma at Phoenix Union High School in 1920. And she said the girls didn't cause her any problem. She was just one of the girls. And I guess the population at that time would have been very mixed, and it wouldn't have been unusual. And plus, she was a very cheerful and friendly girl. And so it wasn't unusual, but it's nice to hear, again, from somebody who was actually there, that it wasn't all terrible every minute of the day. She got involved in community service, and towards the end of her life, she taught the Pima language and culture at kindergarten classes. And here are some excerpts from her book and a photo right here of the cradle board. Caring for the children was a thing the old-time Pimas loved to do. Fathers bent cradle board frames like the one in the picture. Mothers made soft cottonwood bark pads and willow sunshades. The old men of the village wove little cotton blankets. How happy the babies loved to have their cradle boards rocked by the wind, while a little aunt or cousin sang them a lullaby. So that's a day in the life of Anna Moore Shaw. And when she's very young, probably 4, she goes to her brother's school, and that's in the neighborhood, the grade school, to see Santa Claus. And she said he had white hair all around his face. And she called herself Chihia as a young girl, and she writes in the second person. And she said, Chihia picked up a red fruit and asked Willie what it was called. Little sister, that is an apple. It is called apple. She wondered what kind of a tree would bear such pretty fruit. She lifted it up by the stem, and her childlike brain could not imagine such an amazing tree. And so she grows up. She tells us the story of the Indian school. And in the caption, she says, I'm all spruced up for a date with Ross. I seem pretty proud of the new dress I made in the Indian school sewing class. Our dates were very different from those modern teenagers, for back then the school was quite strict. They never even let us hold hands. And Ross was evidently an athlete and quite a hunk, and she was very pleased. He had to go away to World War I, and when he came back, they got married. But she says earlier, once Ross beat an Apache boy in a track meet, much to the delight of us Indians from other tribes. Evidently, Apaches were like lording over their running skills. So she was just delighted. And this is kind of an insight. You wouldn't occur to you that, one group would not like the other group for their pride. As the time came for Ross's return from the war, my plans for a higher education began to lose their appeal. I was now 21 years old, and marriage and a family seemed more important to me than college books. And here she is holding her 18-month-old son while the 7-month-old baby sits in the baby carriage. And this is a 1920s baby carriage. Probably get it from Sears if you wanted to. So this is, oh, I might even make it. Filaree, another one that is based on a true story of Marguerite Noble's mother and father, and she's one of the children. I think I've decided she's Marybelle, one of the younger girls. But she turned it into a fiction and using the facts that she knew and then just kind of putting in, and also, I'm sure, the attitudes that she felt. One critic, Howard Fast, says this book comes closer to the truth and the validity of the so-called winning of the West than anything I've ever read. It is terrifying, heartbreaking, and remarkable. Filaree is also one of the most magnificent portraits of a woman that exists in our literature. And again, not just Western literature, but, and then here's an actress. I love Filaree. I didn't just read it, I crawled between the pages and lived it. And that's Lily Tomlin. And she bought the film rights to Filaree. But so far, I don't think she's gotten the production money to do it because it doesn't have any aliens and it doesn't have any psycho killers in it. So who knows if it'll ever get to be made, but it's a wonderful book. Marguerite Noble was born on January 29th, 1910 in the town of Roosevelt, Arizona Territory. And her father furnished the mules for Roosevelt Dam construction. So we got Roosevelt and Roosevelt Lake and Globe, and of course the dam is right there. And so that's the area where they lived. She went to elementary school at Pumpkin Center. So I made sure this map had Pumpkin Center on it. And I just loved the name. You couldn't make up a name like that. And she went to school there and in Florence, Arizona, and then Tempe Normal School, got her bachelor's degree and her master's degrees from Arizona State University. And actually Tempe Normal, I think it switched in 1956. So we know exactly how old she was when she started there and when she finished. But she taught for 30 years at Creighton School in Phoenix, where she emphasized Arizona history in her classes. She also taught high school and university classes. And her account of the life of a pioneer woman was required reading in Arizona colleges. I used to see this thing in used bookstores in the 60s and 70s everywhere. And I never bought it because I thought, oh, it's fiction. I don't want to read fiction. And finally, I read it and I was like, oh, I could have read it a lot earlier. It's just the most accurate and descriptive that I can imagine. But that's why you can find copies of this everywhere, because it was required reading. So they had lots of them left over in the bookstores. And here's one of her, one of her stories, give you an idea. She's not your fiction wife that hangs on the husband's shoulder and depends on him. She pulled her sunbonnet lower to block the glare of the winter sun and the sight of the man. It helped her to forget for a moment that she was trapped in this land with him. Her glance fell on her distended stomach, and the thought came, bloated as a dead cow. Rage enveloped her. She had a hunger for something more than 6 children, a husband she did not love, and days of monotonous drudgery with few escapes for pleasure or change. The street grew quiet except for the jingle of the piano notes that came from the saloon. A woman's brassy voice sang, "Bet on the Gray." She heard loud laughter. Shivering, she reached in the back of the wagon, pulled out a knitted shawl, and wrapped it close around her shoulders. She wasn't allowed to go into the saloon, nor would he want her in the saloon. So she had to wait out there until he was done drinking, which who knows how long that would be. And so that's a wonderful story. She winds up being a cook at a mining camp on the Colorado River by Quartzsite. And then comes back and is a sharecropper in Tempe and raises the children, and they go to college. And even at the end of her life, she's still carrying a Colt 45 on her hip, which embarrasses her daughter. But it's a wonderful story, and I'm really hope that you will try it out. And then finally, the most recent and pretty much the same era, but this is These Is My Words, and it's a combination of the diary of Nancy Turner's grandmother, Sarah Agnes Prine, 1881 to 1901. And then, of course, she filled it out with lots of research. I was at the front desk at the Historical Society filling in one day, and she came in and she said, yes, I spent a lot of time in this archive. And when I read the book, again, I didn't believe in the fiction until finally I was teaching a class and somebody said, oh, you've got to read it. It's all about what you've been talking about in your classes. And that was enough for me. But so she did a lot of research. And when I read it, it was almost like I could walk around the town of Tucson in the 1870s and say hello to all the people I've been reading about, because she really put them in the book well. Sarah Prine and her family followed their father's dreams and headed west. They survived an Indian attack en route, and the father dies, and her two brothers and mama start a ranch. The story is based on the author's grandmother's diaries. Sarah falls in love with a handsome army officer, and the novel, it's a romance novel written at such a flowing pace, you can't put it down. I think it took me about a week and a half to read this thing, because she ends every chapter on some high note where you have this, like a serial, you've got to tune in next week and find out what happens. So she really built this thing well. So it's a great read. Sarah goes through an unhappy marriage and then a happy one, but plenty of tragedies, the bittersweet life of a strong Arizona pioneer woman. And here's a little colorful description. Brittle brush and prickly pears are everywhere along the banks of the San Pedro River. It's thick with mosquitoes and brambles and high cottonwoods. A cottonwood makes a little sound with the leaves, like they're talking to each other, a gentle and soft sound. In the fall, they turn yellow and copper, and on the ground under cottonwood looks like it's covered with pennies. Under our cottonwood back home, I used to collect the pennies and pretend I was rich. One time I sewed them onto a bonnet to be pretty, but they dried out and fell off. And so that is The Lives of Arizonans. And those are my books, but I recommend these others. I think you'll really enjoy them. Thank you very much. Applause, applause, applause.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Jim.
Sure.
Do we have any questions? If you'd like, you can turn on your camera, microphone, put a question in the chat.
While we're waiting, have you got any questions, Jean?
I don't have any questions. I've read some of those books.
Have you?
Yeah, in the past. They were some of the, my History of the Southwest and some of the other things. I've read a number of those books, so they are very good. I love the first person accounts that really give you a sense of the time and place. And it's always interesting when you're reading those as part of a history class to kind of have the context and understand the significance of some of the things that they talk about. Like you were talking about the China set that she loses and that kind of thing. And just trying to put yourself into the shoes of these, particularly the women, and what it's like to be in a completely new environment in that time period, coming with your own prejudices and perspectives, and you're the way you grew up in a totally different culture and a different environment, coming to a desert environment, for example, for some of these places in Arizona, and just trying to adapt. I think one of the things, for example, with Martha, is that she, by the end of the book, she is really demonstrating a pretty healthy respect for the indigenous people who live there. She became friends with them. They helped her quite a bit with raising her son, and and just kind of adapting to the new environment. You know, why are you wearing these big, heavy dresses
And
and
then
all
when
that
she
kind of
went back
stuff?
east, she's wearing the
Yeah.
flowing cotton skirts and the
Yeah.
white blouses. And her cigarettes got impounded in San Francisco. They were Mexican cigarettes. So it was
Yeah.
like, what have you got contraband here? But
Yeah.
she went Western. She definitely did.
Yeah.
And you can just feel it as she's writing. I mean, you can just feel the change as she's writing about, oh, isn't this horrible? And then eventually it's like, oh, they're just, taking it easy and I'm learning from them. And so, yeah, that's a great book.
Yeah, and of course the Native American women that wrote their books, they all come from different backgrounds. So very interesting. You know, I just recommend just trying out one of the books that Jim talked about so you get a little bit of kind of firsthand account, or, you know, like a Zane Grey type of thing. It's that perspective of Arizona in that time period. So it's just giving you an insight into the different time periods and the different lives of people here in the state where we live.
The thing about the Riders of the Purple Sage is major characters are the Witherspoons, which they're the Wetherills. And so it's again Monument Valley trading post. So you get kind of an insight. He describes those people. So you again get to read about the people who went out in the middle of nowhere. Really, Monument Valley is, you can't get much farther away from anything. And so, yeah, he fell in love with it, and then he told us about who he was seeing, the trading post. And to have an author out there describing people at a trading post, that's really valuable. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just the way they describe it. And as you said, and as I also said, it's the emotions. It's just like that little girl when she saw an apple. That was important. It was important enough to put it in her biography because it was really, and you never think of those things. You just think, oh, they chased me and they cut my hair off and they did oh, wow, it's an apple.
Yeah.
Little kids aren't as indestructible as you might think, and she's just like, this is more important to me in my memories. And the boy girl stuff is just delightful, both with Helen and with Anna. It's more important than college. I'm just going to have these babies and I'm with Ross and it doesn't matter. There is something called an apple Indian where they're red on the outside and white on the inside. But, it's just like there in my graduate courses, we talked about agency and how minorities, people that were marginalized, learned how to get through the system and get what they needed for their children by going by the rules and yet bending the rules a little bit and making it happen for them. And basically, these are two women that had their, kind of lives were kind of constructed by the U.S. government, but they managed to get their needs and those of their children filled by complying in some ways, and yet that little turnaround at the end where Emory Jr. brings back the culture that they were supposed to be killing off. And by going to the Indian school, government Indian school, and then raising her children to go to school, she saved the Hopi culture, basically. And by working within the system, I guess. And it's a really nice story.
Yeah. Just a couple of comments here. So Vanjie said, "It was a fascinating new reads for the summer. Thank you for the great presentation. It was new to me." And Vanjie, I know you joined us a little late, so this will be recorded and we'll put it up on YouTube. So if you want to go back and check out the beginning of the presentation, that will be available, and we'll send that out to the rest of the group of folks who are interested in our stories as well. Kathy mentioned this has been an A+ presentation. We're lucky to hear Jim Turner reviews, and I love the quotes. I'm going to try to find these books to read for myself. Thank you so much. And James said, thank you for another great presentation.
Great.
All right. Thanks, everybody. It's been good to see you. One more thing. Jim says, while visiting Taos several years ago, I stopped by the church south of town, and the priest was just opening the site for the day. In chatting with him, an immigrant from Scotland, he said that while living initially in the upper Midwest, he had read Cather's Archbishop book and requests a transfer to Taos.
Oh my
He's been there for
gosh,
10 years.
that's wonderful.
So yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I'm getting a chill over that one, but I'm sure it had an impact on a lot of people. And it is just, it's so warm. It reminds me of like Going My Way, because at the end he's on his deathbed like Barry Fitzgerald and everybody loves him. And it's just like, there's so much emotion in that book all the way through it. And so much love for the people and for the priests, for each other. And it's just a wonderful book. It's one of those books where you get to the end and you're mad because it's going to be done and you're not going to find another book this good for a while. Yep.
Okay.
Our time is up.
Yes. Are there any other last questions or comments from anyone? Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Stay cool.
Yep.
And we'll see you guys again in August, and I'll let everybody know when the YouTube video is available for anyone who might want to check this out again. And
you can check Amazon or Rio Nuevo Publishers online for when my new book comes out. And the Four Corners book is out there now on Amazon, and you get it cheaper at Amazon, and I don't get a royalty for it. So why not get the best price you can? Thank you all.